The wind was loud enough to erase thought. Snow cut sideways across the road, swallowing the shoulder, the signs, the distance. A woman stood alone where no one was meant to stand. Her coat hung open. Her hair was frozen stiff against her face. She wasn't waving. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't even watching for headlights. She just stood there, unmoving, as if the storm had already decided something for her. 50 yards away, a Navy SEAL slowed his truck. Beside him, his K9 went completely still. No bark, no warning, just a sudden, unnatural pause. And in that silence, the SEAL understood something was wrong. That if he didn't stop now, no one ever would. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. The truck idled unevenly, engine rattling against the cold. The road ahead was barely visible, reduced to 2 pale lines vanishing into white. The Navy SEAL kept both hands on the wheel, posture rigid, eyes forward. He'd driven this stretch before. Remote, forgotten, the kind of place where mistakes didn't get corrected quickly. Beside him, his K9, an aging but powerful German shepherd, sat upright, ears alert beneath a dusting of snow that had blown in when the window cracked open. The dog hadn't moved since they crested the last bend. Easy, the SEAL muttered, more to himself than the dog. The figure ahead sharpened slowly through the storm. A woman. No car nearby. No flares. No movement. She stood with her back half turned to the wind, arms hanging loose at her sides, coat flapping open like she'd forgotten to close it. The K9 let out a low sound. Not a bark. Not a whine. Something restrained. Wrong. The SEAL eased his foot off the gas. Training told him to assess. Weather like this killed good people fast. Stopping carried risk. So did not stopping. The dog shifted forward, muscles tight, nose pressed toward the windshield. That decided it. The truck rolled to a stop 20 yards short. Snow immediately began filling the tire tracks. The SEAL killed the engine and sat still for 1 beat too long, watching the woman sway slightly, like she might fall, or like she already had and just hadn't reached the ground yet. The cold hit him the moment he opened the door. Sharp, invasive, stealing breath. He stepped down carefully, boots sinking deep into powder that hadn't yet crusted over. The wind tore at his jacket, forcing his eyes to narrow. Behind him, the K9 jumped down without command. "Stay close," the SEAL said, voice clipped. The woman didn't turn when they approached. Up close, he could see her hands were bare, red, cracked. Her coat was thin, the kind meant for errands, not storms. Snow clung to her lashes, her cheeks pale beneath it. "Ma'am," he called, keeping distance. "Can you hear me?" No response. The K9 moved first, circling slightly, careful not to startle. The dog stopped at her side and sat, head tilted upward, eyes fixed on her face. The SEAL noticed then her lips were moving, not speaking, counting maybe, or praying. He stepped closer. "Ma'am." She blinked slowly and turned her head. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy. Shock, he thought. Or worse. "I'm fine," she said, though the words came late, dragged out. "I'm just waiting." For what? She looked past him, toward the white nothing of the road. For it to stop hurting. The K9 pressed his shoulder gently against her leg, steadying her as she wobbled. The SEAL felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't someone who'd just broken down. This was someone who had already decided not to move. He guided her toward the truck slowly, 1 step at a time. She resisted at first, not physically, but with the dull stubbornness of someone running out of reasons. "I don't want to be trouble," she murmured. "You're not," he said, firm. "You're cold." The K9 stayed glued to her side, body angled protectively, matching her pace. Every few steps, the dog glanced up at the SEAL, as if checking alignment, waiting for correction that never came. Inside the cab, warmth flooded in. The woman sagged into the seat, breath shuddering as sensation returned painfully to her hands. The seal wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, movements practiced, economical. "My name's Ruth," she said suddenly, staring at the dashboard. "I used to wait out storms with my husband. He said they always pass." The K9 rested his chin on her knee. She flinched, then softened, fingers curling weakly into the fur. "He died last winter," she continued, voice flat. "Heart. Middle of the night. I didn't hear him fall." The seal didn't respond. He adjusted the heat, handed her a bottle of water, loosened the vents toward her feet. Silence felt safer than words. Outside, the storm howled, relentless. Ruth exhaled shakily. "I walked until I couldn't feel anything anymore. Thought maybe if I stood still long enough, it would take care of the rest." The K9 lifted his head, eyes steady on her face. She swallowed hard. He wouldn't have liked that. They drove slowly, hazard lights cutting weakly through the snow. The seal kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the console. Ready. The K9 had shifted into the back seat, watching Ruth through the gap, never fully relaxing. Ruth stared out the window, voice quieter now. "I didn't plan to die today," she said. "I just didn't plan to keep living either." The seal glanced at her once, then back to the road. Storms don't care about plans. She almost smiled at that. The K9 stood suddenly, bracing himself as the truck slid slightly on black ice. The seal corrected smoothly, heart rate unchanged. Training. Muscle memory. Ruth noticed the dog then. Really noticed him. "He didn't leave me," she said softly. "Out there." "No," the seal replied. "He won't." They reached a small turnout where the road dipped toward a cluster of dark shapes. Buildings, maybe. Civilization, thin but real. Ruth's hands had stopped shaking. Color was returning to her face. She pressed her palm briefly to the window, grounding herself. "I don't know why you stopped," she said. The seal didn't answer immediately. He slowed further, scanning the road ahead. "Neither did I," he said finally. "But he did." The K9 met Ruth's gaze, tail thumping once against the seat. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the truck, something had already shifted, fragile and unfinished, like warmth just beginning to take hold. The turnout led to a narrow access road half buried under snow. A single building sat at the end of it, lights on, generator humming low. A volunteer fire station, unmanned this time of night, but unlocked for emergencies. The seal pulled in and cut the engine. The sudden quiet felt heavy. Ruth didn't move at first. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers stiff, knuckles swollen and red. The K9 jumped down and waited by her door, sitting squarely, patient. "You're safe here," the seal said. "Heat, phone. People will come once the storm eases." She nodded, but didn't open the door. "I didn't mean to make you responsible for me," she said. "I just needed somewhere to stand." The seal opened his door and walked around, boots crunching. He opened hers gently. Warm air rushed out and vanished into the storm. "You don't become responsible just because you stop," he said. "You become present." The K9 rose and pressed his body lightly against Ruth's leg again, grounding her. She inhaled sharply, then leaned into the contact, as if her balance depended on it. Inside the station, the lights flickered but held. The seal found a chair, guided her into it, wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. He checked her hands, circulation slow but returning. Painful but manageable. Ruth closed her eyes. "I thought if I stayed out there long enough," she whispered, "I wouldn't have to decide anything anymore." The seal watched the K9 settle at her feet, head up, alert. "Decisions don't disappear," he said quietly. "They wait." The station smelled of oil, metal, and old coffee. The seal found a first aid kit and worked in silence, rubbing warmth back into Ruth's hands with slow, deliberate pressure. She winced, then nodded for him to continue. The canine didn't move. Every few seconds, his ears flicked toward the door, tracking the storm, the world beyond. Ruth watched the man's hands. Scarred. Steady. "You've done this before," she said. "Yes." "For strangers." "Yes." She absorbed that. "Why?" He paused, just briefly. "Because someone once did it for me." That was all he offered. Ruth leaned back, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline. "My husband used to say grief is loud at first," she murmured. "Then it gets quiet. That's when it's dangerous." The seal nodded once. He understood quiet. Outside, the wind slammed against the building, rattling the doors. The lights flickered again. The canine stood immediately, placing himself between Ruth and the entrance, posture rigid. "It's just the storm," the seal said, calm but alert. The dog didn't relax. Ruth noticed. "He's protecting me." "He's assessing," the seal corrected. "Protection comes after." She smiled faintly at that distinction. Minutes passed. The radio crackled to life with distant voices coordinating plows and emergency crews. Help was moving slowly but surely. Ruth exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. "I don't want to go back to an empty house," she said suddenly. "But I don't want to disappear either." The seal closed the kit. "Then tonight," he said, "you don't do either." A county truck arrived just before dawn, headlights cutting through thinning snow. 2 responders stepped out, faces weary but kind. The seal briefed them quickly, efficiently. Ruth answered their questions with more clarity now, her voice steadier. As they prepared to take her to the hospital for observation, Ruth hesitated. She looked down at the canine, who had not left her side once. "Will I see him again?" she asked, surprising herself. The seal considered the question. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you keep choosing to stay." She nodded slowly, understanding more than the words suggested. Before she stood, she reached down and pressed her forehead briefly against the canine's head. He accepted it without movement, solid and warm. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to the dog. The responders guided her toward their truck. She turned once more. "You stopped," she said to the seal. "You didn't have to." He watched the snow settle on the ground, softer now. "Neither did you," he replied. As the truck pulled away, the canine remained still, eyes tracking until the lights vanished. Only then did he exhale, tension easing from his frame. The seal rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder. "Good work." The canine looked up at him, tail wagging once, restrained but satisfied. The storm was breaking. Pale light crept across the horizon, revealing a road that still existed, still led somewhere. They drove back the way they'd come, slower now, the danger receding but not forgotten. The seal kept the radio low, listening to updates, to voices that meant continuity. The K9 lay down in the back seat, finally resting, eyes half closed but aware. The seal replayed the moment he'd almost driven past. The way the storm had blurred everything. The way the dog had stopped him without sound. At a bend in the road, he pulled over briefly and shut off the engine. Dawn stretched thin and pale across the snowfields. "You knew," he said quietly. The K9 lifted his head. "You always do." The dog didn't respond, of course. He simply watched the world, steady and present. The seal sat there longer than necessary, letting the silence exist without fighting it. He thought of Ruth, of the way she'd stood alone, not asking for help, not moving away either, of how close the line had been. When he finally started the engine again, the road felt different, less hostile, still dangerous but honest. As they drove on, the seal understood something he hadn't allowed himself to name before. Stopping hadn't saved her. Stopping had reminded her she still had a choice. The K9 shifted, settling deeper into the seat, mission complete. For now. The hospital sat low against the horizon, lights glowing softly through frost-covered windows. The SEAL didn't go inside. He stayed in the truck while the responders brought Ruth through the doors, her steps slow but steady. She turned once, lifting a hand in a small, uncertain wave. He nodded back. That was enough. The K9 watched until the doors closed, then lay down again, chin on his paws. The SEAL rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel, breathing out. The kind of breath that came only after holding one too long. He hadn't planned on stopping that night. He'd been driving home from a routine supply run, mind focused on nothing in particular. That was how it usually happened. The moments that mattered rarely announced themselves. As he pulled away from the hospital, the radio crackled with updates. Roads reopening, storm warnings downgraded. Life resuming its slow, indifferent rhythm. The K9 stirred as they passed the stretch of road again. The place where Ruth had stood. In daylight, it looked harmless. A wide shoulder, a gentle curve, no sign of danger. That's how it gets you, the SEAL muttered. When it looks ordinary. The dog's ears flicked. They drove on in silence. The SEAL's thoughts drifted, not backward to old memories, but sideways, to the narrow margin between action and regret, to how close he'd come to choosing differently. At a red light near the edge of town, he caught his reflection in the mirror. Older than he felt, calmer than he used to be. The light changed. He drove on. Morning settled fully by the time they reached the outskirts of town. Snowplows moved methodically, scraping clean lines through what remained of the storm. People emerged cautiously, shoveling driveways, checking mailboxes, waving to neighbors with the quiet relief of survival. The SEAL pulled into a small diner parking lot and shut off the engine. The K9 lifted his head immediately, alert but relaxed. Food, the SEAL said. For both of us. Inside, the diner was warm and smelled of coffee and grease. A few locals sat hunched over mugs, talking softly about the storm. No one paid them much attention. That suited him. He ordered simply, sat in a corner booth where he could see the door. The K9 lay at his feet, eyes half-lidded, body loose now that the danger had passed. The waitress glanced down and smiled. Good dog. The SEAL nodded. Best. As he ate, his phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Ruth was stable. Mild hypothermia. Dehydration. She'd be kept overnight. No permanent damage. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The K9's tail thumped once, sensing the shift. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting off the snow so brightly it hurt to look at. The SEAL finished his coffee and stood. At the door, he paused. For a moment, he considered driving back past the hospital, checking in, saying something more. He didn't. Some things didn't need to be revisited to matter. They spent the afternoon moving slowly through town. The SEAL restocked supplies, checked in with a local contact, listened more than he spoke. The K9 stayed close, a quiet constant at his side. At a hardware store, an older man nodded at them. Storm like that takes things from people, he said. Good you were out there. The SEAL thanked him without explanation. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared completely, blue and wide and deceptively calm. The SEAL parked near a small overlook outside town, engine idling as he watched the horizon. The K9 jumped down and stood beside him, both of them facing the open land. You ever think about how close it gets? The SEAL said quietly. How many times people pass each other without knowing? The dog shifted his weight, leaning lightly against the SEAL's leg. He thought of Ruth again, of her standing still in the storm, not asking, not running, of how easily she could have been missed. The SEAL crouched and rested a hand on the K9's chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath the fur. You did good, he said again. You always do. The dog's ears flicked back briefly, then forward. They stayed there until the sun dipped low, until the light softened and the cold crept back in. When they finally left, The road ahead felt open. Not safe, just possible. That evening, as the SEAL pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed again. A message this time, not from the hospital, but from Ruth. She'd asked the nurse to send it. "They say I'll be okay. I wanted you to know I didn't stand there today. I walked the hall instead. It's not much, but it's movement." He read it twice. The K9 sat beside him, watching. The SEAL typed back slowly. "That's enough for today." He shut off the engine and sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. The house ahead was dark but intact. Waiting. Inside, he fed the K9 first, then himself. Routine. Grounding. Outside, the last of the storm melted into the gutters. Later, as he lay awake listening to the wind ease against the walls, he understood something he'd avoided for years. Not every rescue looked like dragging someone from wreckage. Some looked like stopping, like standing still long enough for someone else to choose differently. The K9 padded into the room and lay down beside the bed. A familiar weight. The SEAL closed his eyes. Tomorrow would come. That was enough. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind that felt undeserved after a storm. The SEAL woke before dawn, habit more than intention. The house was cold, floors creaking softly as he moved. Outside, snow clung to branches in heavy silence. The K9 followed him onto the porch, breath fogging the air. They stood there for a while, listening. No wind, no sirens, just distance. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Ruth. "They're discharging me later today. The doctor says my hands will heal." He asked why I was out there. I didn't know what to say. The SEAL stared at the screen, thumb hovering. He typed slowly. "You don't owe anyone an explanation. Just honesty with yourself." The K9 shifted closer, pressing his weight against the SEAL's leg. The SEAL exhaled. He hadn't realized how invested he'd become until now. Stopping had pulled him into something he couldn't neatly step away from. He poured coffee and sat at the table, watching steam rise from the mug. The quiet pressed in, not threatening, but insistent. He thought about the risk he'd taken, about how easily that night could have gone wrong, about how training never accounted for moments like that, when the danger wasn't an enemy, but indifference. The K9 rested his head on the SEAL's knee. "You don't get to choose what matters," the SEAL murmured. "You just notice it." The dog stayed still. Outside, the sun crept higher, lighting the snow in pale gold. By afternoon, the SEAL found himself driving back toward town without fully deciding to. The road was clear now, plowed and quiet, the storm reduced to memory. The K9 watched through the window, ears relaxed. At the hospital, Ruth sat near a window, hands wrapped around a paper cup. Color had returned to her face, though her movements were careful, deliberate. When she saw them, she froze, then stood. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," the SEAL replied. They stood awkwardly for a moment. No script fit what had happened. Ruth broke the silence. "They asked if I had family, and I said I wasn't sure anymore." She glanced at the K9. "But I said someone stopped." The K9 stepped forward, tail low but wagging once. Ruth knelt slowly, pressing her forehead briefly to his. "I don't know what comes next," she said, standing again. "But I know I don't want to disappear." The SEAL nodded. "That's enough." She studied him. "Does it ever stop hurting?" He considered the question. "No," he said, "but it changes shape." That seemed to satisfy her. As they parted, Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "My address," she said, "in case I forget how to ask for help again." The SEAL took it. Outside, the K9 looked up at him, eyes steady. They drove back in silence, the kind that felt earned. The SEAL didn't replay the storm this time. He thought about the paper in his pocket, about responsibility that didn't come with orders. At a stoplight, the K9 shifted suddenly, attention snapping forward. A man stood on the corner, arguing into a phone, unaware of traffic edging too close. The seal slowed instinctively. The moment passed without incident. But it lingered. "You're always watching," the seal said quietly. The dog settled again. Back home, the seal placed the folded paper on the counter, smoothing it flat. He didn't know if he'd ever use it. That wasn't the point. The point was choice. He cleaned his gear methodically, checking straps, drying boots, restoring order where he could. The K9 lay nearby, eyes tracking every movement. As evening fell, the seal stepped outside again. The road beyond his house stretched empty, harmless now. He imagined Ruth walking a hospital hallway, choosing motion over stillness. He imagined himself driving past that night. The thought tightened his chest. The K9 rose and stood beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. "Yeah," the seal said softly. "Me too." They stayed there until the cold pushed them back inside. Night settled in gently. The seal sat on the edge of his bed, boots off, hands resting on his knees. The house felt different now, not fuller, just less hollow. The K9 lay nearby, breathing slow and even. His phone buzzed one last time. A short message from Ruth. "I went outside today. Just the steps. It was cold, but I didn't stop." He stared at it, then typed back, "Good." He set the phone down and leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. He thought about all the nights he'd driven through storms without stopping. All the times he'd told himself it wasn't his place. The K9 shifted closer, resting his head against the seal's calf. "Guess it was this time," the seal murmured. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, not threatening, just present. He didn't tense. He listened. The world would keep putting people in impossible places. Storms would come without warning. Roads would blur. He couldn't stop every time, but sometimes he would. The K9's breathing remained steady, untroubled. The seal closed his eyes, not to escape the quiet, but to accept it. Tomorrow would come with its own decisions. Tonight, stillness was enough. The storm returned a week later, quieter but no less deliberate. Snow fell straight down this time, thick and patient, covering the road in familiar silence. The Navy SEAL drove slower than usual, hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning the margins. The K9 sat upright, alert. They passed the same stretch of road where Ruth had stood. No footprints now. No sign anything had ever happened. Just snow and distance. The SEAL didn't slow this time. Not because he wouldn't stop, but because there was nothing asking him to. That mattered. The K9's posture eased slightly, tension releasing. The SEAL noticed. He smiled faintly. "You know the difference," he said. The dog flicked an ear. They continued on, the truck's headlights carving a narrow path through the dark. Somewhere ahead, a plow worked methodically. Somewhere behind, the storm erased what it touched. The SEAL thought about how close that night had been. How easily Ruth's story could have ended without sound or witness. How stopping hadn't fixed her life, but had kept it open. He understood now that not every moment demanded action. Some demanded awareness. The K9 shifted, resting his head against the seat. The SEAL adjusted the heat and drove on. The road didn't feel haunted anymore, just honest. Ruth stood at her kitchen window, watching snow fall against the glass. Her hands still ached when the cold crept in, a reminder she didn't resent. Pain meant she was still here to feel it. She wrapped her coat tighter and stepped outside. The air was sharp but manageable. She stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing, letting the cold touch her without swallowing her whole. Down the street, a truck passed slowly, headlights dimmed by snow. For a brief second, she wondered if it was him. It wasn't. That was okay. She went back inside and poured tea, hands steadier now. On the counter sat a folded piece of paper with a phone number she hadn't used yet. She didn't know if she ever would. Choice felt different than obligation. Later, she walked to the end of the driveway and back. Small distance. Real movement. She thought of the dog's weight against her leg. Of the quiet refusal to let her fall. That memory stayed. Not as rescue, as presence. When she went to bed that night, she left the porch light on. Not for anyone else. For herself. The Navy SEAL parked outside his house and sat for a moment before getting out. Snow gathered softly on the hood, muting the world. Inside, the K9 shook off and padded to his usual spot, circling once before lying down. The SEAL hung his jacket, slower than usual. He noticed things more now. The sound of the heater, the weight of quiet that no longer pressed. He took out the folded paper from his pocket and placed it in a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, just there. Later, he stood at the window, watching the road disappear into white. He imagined other people moving through storms tonight. Some stopping, some passing by. He couldn't control that, but he could choose how he moved through his own. The K9 rose and stood beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. "Yeah," the SEAL said softly. "I know." The dog settled again. The SEAL turned off the light and let the dark exist without filling it. He didn't replay the night anymore. He didn't need to. Some moments didn't ask to be remembered loudly. They asked to be carried quietly. Spring came slowly, reluctant at first. Snow melted in narrow lines along the road, revealing pavement beneath. The world didn't transform all at once. It loosened. The Navy SEAL drove that stretch again one morning, sunlight catching the wet asphalt. The K9 lay relaxed in the back seat, eyes half closed. They passed the place where everything had nearly ended. Nothing marked it. That felt right. The SEAL pulled over briefly, not out of necessity, but acknowledgement. He stepped out, breath visible in the cool air. The K9 joined him. They stood there, man and dog, watching the road stretch forward. "You did good," the SEAL said. The K9 leaned against him once, solid and unspoken. Somewhere not far away, Ruth was walking her neighborhood. Not far, not fast, but moving. The SEAL got back into the truck and drove on. The road didn't promise safety, only possibility, and that was enough. Some storms don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, asking only one thing, whether someone will notice. If the story stayed with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from. Subscribe, like, or ring the bell if stories like this matter to you. Sometimes, stopping is how hope keeps moving.